sharp, I think we'll begin the session this morning. Anand Gopal has served as an Afghanistan correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor, and has reported on the Middle East and South Asia for Harper's, The Nation, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, as well as other publications. Gopal is a fellow at the New America Foundation. He will speak to us today about his first book, titled No Good Men Among the Living: America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. There will be time for questions during the last 10 to 20 minutes of the session this morning, and Anand will be signing books directly following the session at the book signing area. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So my book, the subtitle of the book is The War Through Afghan Eyes. And so what I want to explain to you today is a little bit about how I got to the point of wanting to write a book through the eyes of Afghans and what that means. But before I start that, I want to tell you a story about the first time that I met a member of the Taliban. This was back in 2008. And at the time, I was sort of traveling around the countryside on a motorcycle. And I got contact with a Taliban commander. And this is somebody who was fighting against the U.S. military. He was an insurgent commander. And so, of course, I was fascinated and very interested to try to understand what motivates these people. And if we remember, the Taliban very famously had a draconian regime in the 1990s, which outlawed women's education, which kept women in the homes, which was, they had people walking around with whips, seeing how long your beard was. And so I was interested in trying to understand, what would possibly motivate somebody to join such a, frankly, ridiculous seeming regime. And so I made contact with him, and he and his unit were based on the top of a mountain in rural Afghanistan. So I went out to this mountain, and it took basically a day to get to the top of hiking. And when I got up there, I went through a sort of narrow trail and went to a small village at the very top. And sure enough, sitting in one of the houses were a group of Taliban fighters, about 12 or 13 fighters. And so I went inside and sat down, and they were all sitting cross-legged. They had Kalashnikovs on their laps, and I took out my notebook and I started interviewing them. Started interviewing the commander specifically and asking him questions like, why are you fighting against the U.S.? What kind of society do you want? What's your assessment of the 1990s regime, which is when the Taliban were in power? And so he gave me sort of terse boilerplate answers for all of them. But at some point he stopped me and he told me, you're actually the first foreigner that I've ever met. And of course the first American that I've ever met. So, can I ask you some questions? So I said, yeah, sure. So he started asking me questions like, and this is 2008, so President Obama had just announced, 2009, sorry, President Obama had just announced a troop surge. So he asked me, why is your president wanting to surge troops to our country? Why is he sending more troops? So I tried to explain to him about, U.S. geopolitical concerns and sort of domestic politics. Then he asked, why did your country come to Afghanistan in the first place? It turns out he knew very little about 9/11. So I tried to explain to him about 9/11 and what that was all about in the war on terror. And then he started asking me questions about cultural life in the United States. So he asked me, I heard that in the U.S., women walk around naked and nobody controls them. And I was like, well, that's not exactly correct. And I tried to explain to him the differences in culture between the U.S. and Afghanistan. At some point, he asked me, have you ever seen the film The Titanic? I said, yes, I've seen the movie. And he asked me, how come your country doesn't make movies like that anymore? And it turned out, actually, that he was a big fan of The Titanic, as were many members of the Taliban. In the 1990s, the Taliban regime had outlawed The Titanic, but in fact, it was very popular amongst members of the Taliban, and they traded it around like samizdat, and people would go and get like Leonardo DiCaprio haircuts. And that was the first inkling that I got that sort of the categories I had in my mind in thinking about Afghanistan, the Taliban, and the various other political actors there. They get complicated when you actually go and talk to people and hear stories on the ground. And that was really that is really the sort of the underlying theme of my book, which is that the categories that we've come to think of as defining the war on terror, which is there are terrorists, there are good guys, there are bad guys. It makes a lot of sense sitting over here, but when you're on the ground, these categories are remarkably fluid, and in fact, they don't often make sense if we try to think about them that way. And so I learned that story. It took me many years to sort of come to that understanding, because I came to Afghanistan in 2008. I had actually switched careers. I used to do physics, but I lived across the street from the Twin Towers, and on 9/11, I saw the attacks, and I knew people who were killed in the attacks. And so since that time, I was always interested and fascinated about by our policy in the Middle East and South Asia, and I was following the war against Al-Qaeda from afar, and I was always sort of dissatisfied with my level of understanding of what was happening. And so in 2008, I decided to switch careers, and I moved to Afghanistan as a freelancer. And at the time, if you went to Afghanistan, that means usually you lived in Kabul, which is a relatively cosmopolitan city compared to the rest of the country, and it's relatively safe as well. So the war isn't actually taking place inside Kabul. The war is taking place in the south and in the east along the border with Pakistan for the most part. And so my time as a journalist in Kabul was mostly going to press conferences and writing up 500, 600 word stories about what was happening in the countryside. And so very quickly I got frustrated by the lack of access to what was actually happening. I had come to cover the war, but I wasn't actually able to cover the war. So at some point, I decided to take a different tack, and I grew out my beard. I bought a motorcycle, and I hit the road and went down to the south, to the areas where the war is being fought. And I took advantage of Afghan hospitality, which is very extraordinary, and I was able to live in various villages with tribal elders and village heads. Usually 3 or 4 days at a time, I'd be passed from one village to the next. And in the process of that, I met many, many, many people, hundreds of people, and heard many stories. And the stories that I heard challenged the preconceived notions that I had about what the war was about. So essentially the problem of Afghanistan, or the question that I tried to answer, was this, which is that the Taliban regime was one of the worst, most radical, draconian regimes in recent memory, and they were defeated very easily after 9/11. It took basically 2 months of an air campaign to cause the Taliban to crumble. And most Afghans that I spoke to welcomed the defeat of the Taliban. They wanted the U.S. to come and save them from the Taliban. And yet, 5 or 6 years later, some of these same Afghans went and started supporting the Taliban. The Taliban grew from a defeated force to a very powerful insurgency, which exists to this day, which is still fighting U.S.-backed troops, meaning the Afghan army, and there's a few U.S. soldiers still in Afghanistan. And so the question is, how did that happen? What was the transformation? What caused that to happen? That's the question that I try to answer in the book, and I do that by trying to get the Afghan perspective. And so I collected hundreds of interviews and hundreds of life stories, many of which I include in the book, but there are 3 in particular that I focused on. One is the story of a warlord or a politician who is also a warlord who is aligned with the United States military. He's a very powerful man. His name is John Mohammed Khan. The U.S. used to call him JMK for short. And his life is very interesting because he was a school janitor back in the 1970s, illiterate also in the 70s. And the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And once that happened, it sort of ushered in a